Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Baker. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need absolutely no introduction. You've been Secretary of State for Environment, Secretary of State for Education and Science from 1986 to 1989, and then you became the Chairman of the Conservative from 1989 to 1990, and then when John Major became Prime Minister, he appointed you as Home Secretary, and then following your departure from the government in 1992. So my first question is that how did you get involved in politics, and how ambitious were you when you started politics?
I first really got involved in politics, I think, a little bit at school, but not very much, more in debating at school, but rather more at Oxford. And you must remember that in my time, everybody had to do 2 years national service. So one left school, and I would join the army. I was a gunner, I served in Egypt for 2 years, and I became an artillery instructor. I rather enjoyed that. It was a very good break before university. You could enjoy university much more, because in those 2 years you grew up quite quickly. But then I came back and went to Oxford. I got very involved in politics in Oxford, both in the Conservative Association and the Union. And my interest really stems from there. But the politics of that time are fundamentally different from the politics of today. 50 years ago, the whole political scene was dominated by two parties. And since, in fact, 1830, in the 19th century and 20th century, British history and politics can only be really understood by recognising that the two parties really divided power between them. And it was two parties. First it was the Tories and the Whigs, then it was the Tories and the Liberals, then it was the Tories and Labour. And the other parties, the little parties did try to get established, but they never succeeded. And the great advantage of that two-party system was it gave Britain a considerable degree of stability. It prevented Britain from being, on the one hand, a socialist and communist country, or on the other hand, a fascist country. We gravitated through all those exciting temptations on either side and stayed very steady. That is no longer the position. In the election we're about to face in 2015, there will not only be the Conservatives and Labour, but also Liberals, much more than they were 50 years ago, but not as many as they have now. And then there's the Greens, and you've then got the Scottish Nationalists, and now UKIP. And so this is now a multi-party situation. And that is quite likely to lead to a period of chaos and indecision after the next election. Because it's the abandonment of the two parties. So you might ask why it's happened. I think it's happened for a variety of reasons. I think modern media is quite a cause of it. When everybody can have their own Twitter account and their own Facebook account, and immediately let the world know what they say, and they disagree with each other, but also with what any party says.
Yes.
And also the desire through media for immediate satisfaction of all problems, or immediate gratification of all desires. And that is very difficult for politicians to handle, because politicians have to arbitrate between the natural wishes of a community and the ability to meet those wishes in a sensible, reasonable and financially possible way. That's the job of a politician, and that usually means considerable caution. And so politicians, as it were, are on the defensive from the word go. And so it's very different from what it was. Also, the other great power, I remember when I first joined the House in 1968, there would be debates on things like Scottish land ownership and hardly any Northern Ireland matters. Also, at the same time, a great amount of power has been devolved to the European Assembly and to the Commission and to the whole apparatus of Europe. And lots of decisions used to be taken when I first entered politics, now taken in Brussels or Strasbourg. And so the nature of politics has changed fundamentally in Britain, very different. At the same time, I think the influence of the House of Commons as a debating chamber has been reduced. And I don't think this is just an old man regretting the past and all the rest of it. But to give you some idea, when I first went in, the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian and the Times had a whole page every day of the debates in the House of Commons, and your great ambition was to get a column inch of the speech that you made as a backbencher. These aren't reported at all today. There are a few very clever, cynical writers who write about question time, and that's about it, and occasionally political matters. But there's no attempt to actually inform the public of what is going on in the House. And you only get into the news when some backbencher is demanding the death of his leader or the assassination of his leader. And so it has changed, because in my time there were some very big figures on the backbenches, Michael Foots of this world, and that's Powell as well, Ian MacLeod, great orators, all of those great orators. And so
Willie Whitelaw.
Willie Whitelaw, yes, quite a different character, but a figure. There's no question about it. And what is extraordinary, and you might think I'm making just an anti-Labour comment, the membership of the Shadow Cabinet today is so thin. I think if I was most people in the street, they probably could only mention 1 or 2 members of the Shadow Cabinet. But that was never the way. The Labour Party had big figures, the Dennis Healeys of this world, the Ernest Bevins of this world, and the Nye Bevins, the Michael Foots, and they made a stir in the country. But today they don't. And also, there's not all that great breadth of talent in either of the other parties as well.
No, absolutely right.
And so that's the change that's happened.
And actually British politics has massively changed from 1968 that you first entered into Parliament. And did your education at Oxford made it easier for you to enter politics?
I suppose it did to some extent, because one had kicked around in politics at Oxford. At a very exciting time. I was in Oxford, I was up in Oxford during the Suez invasion. And that was 1957, one of the great sort of events since the war, no question about that. And it was very interesting how no studying was done in Oxford for a fortnight. There were just marches and counter marches up and down the High. There were ministers who resigned, come to speak to large meetings and all the rest of it. It looked as if the Conservatives were going to be trounced, which they were, and embarrassed, which they were. And I remember walking up the High. I was then the chairman of the Conservatives Oxford, with the chairman of the Labour Party Club, called Brian Walden, who turned out to be who was actually probably the most eloquent speaker of my generation. And he got into the House of Commons, but he never made great progress, because he had other interests, which were mainly centred upon the racecourse. And so it was a pity. He was a very great talent. And I remember having a bet with him. He was so appalled by what Eton had done and what Macmillan was doing. He said, "You'll never be in office again for the rest of this century." And so we had a bet of £5. I can't tell you how much £5 was worth in those days. We would live about a fortnight on it. And we had a bet that we would. And of course we did. Not only we won the next election, 1959, under Macmillan. Brian never paid his debt. There we are. And so I suppose being at Oxford, yes, it helped, because when I kicked around, one had met figures. I remember when I was a member of the Union at Oxford, entertaining Clement Attlee to dinner one night. It was fascinating to have dinner with someone like Clement Attlee. He was the greatest leader the Labour Party ever had, actually, without any question of doubt. An incredibly modest man. His wife drove him to Oxford in a tiny little Austin car, and her greatest concern is where she could park without getting a ticket. This for the wife of the very great Prime Minister. It was a different world, yes, I suppose it did. But that's only a beginning, really. I then stood as a councillor in my local area. In those days, you had to start in a more humble way. First, you had to help with a local association, knocking on doors, collecting money, helping with the annual fete and this sort of thing. And then you might stand as a councillor. And then, if you were lucky to go on the candidates list, you first fought a safe Labour seat, which I did in the East End of London in 1964. The Poplar, the minor, the Dockers seat. And that was a tremendous experience. And then you went on to fight a marginal. So I fought 6-6, the marginal Acton, which just lost. I didn't win it back. But I happened to be still the candidate in 1967 when the sitting member committed suicide. It's very unusual for a member of Parliament to commit suicide. But he was being fingered as the fifth man in the spy-ring. He wasn't, but he knew them all. And he was great. He was a well-off man who lived in Regent's Park. He should really be a don at a provincial university, not a politician. And it was too much for him. and he committed suicide. And the by-election, I was bound to win. Wilson was massively unpopular. I was bound to win, and I had to then decide whether I should go into business or politics, because I was then the chief executive of a publicly quoted company, a manufacturing company, and I ran 5 factories. I had to decide whether it was going to be business or politics. And I did decide politics. I think today anybody given that choice would invariably not choose politics.
Why is that?
Because it's become a goldfish bowl where you have to reveal absolutely everything about your wife, your family, your relations, your children. Privacy is totally and completely invaded. And now, members of Parliament really are not allowed, or virtually not allowed, to have any outside interests. Whereas when I was in politics, when we were in opposition, I had quite interesting outside interests. And I think that's very important for an MP to have. Now, it's frowned upon. You must spend your entire time as a constituency member. And that, I think, will lead to a less interesting House of Commons, and a more routine House of Commons, and a more pedestrian House of Commons. But I'm sounding very much like an old man who says, Kelly Pock, Kelly Pock. Never mind. And so I won this by-election. Do you have any idea how unpopular Wilson was? During the course of the by-election, or 3 weeks, George Brown, the deputy leader, resigned as deputy leader from the cabinet, the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Roy Jenkins had to close the banks for 3 days, on a Thursday, Friday and Saturday, to stop on the pound.
He was the Chancellor of Exchequer.
He was Chancellor of Exchequer, and he brought in the tax rises in those days of £1 billion, absolutely staggering, you can see. In those circumstances, a donkey would have won. And I won with a large swing. I got into the House for 2 years. I was really a protege of Ian MacLeod. Ian MacLeod, I think, was the most eloquent speaker that the Tories have had since the war, and a very attractive figure. He'd been wounded during the war, and he was slightly stooped and like that, but then he would stand at the dispatch box. He made his money being a professional bridge player. So he had a photographic memory. And he would stand at the dispatch box, and he said, without a note, he said, turned to us, he said, and does the Prime Minister recall that on the 11th of June 1958, he said this at column 736 of Hansard? He would roll it out like that. He was a very impressive performer. But he was a centre-left Conservative, and if he hadn't died so tragically just after Ted Heath's victory in 1970, I think he'd have steered that government away from some of the mistakes that it made. He was a great figure, and certainly I loved working with him. And then anyway, I lost in the following election, but in the same year I got another seat, a Conservative seat in Central London. Sorry, just had a way of telling me some exciting thing.
Absolutely. More important than the Prime Minister, Lord Baker.
Right, okay. And so, and in the Edward Heath government,
how did you get
I joined halfway
with
through
his government?
I wasn't in when he became Prime Minister in the month of June. I got back in October. But in 1972, he asked me to join the government. I was the most junior minister in the government. I was the Parliament Secretary of the Civil Service Department. I was so junior, I was the bottom of the list, often left off the paper. But I was actually Ted Heath's junior minister, because he was the Minister of the Civil Service. He didn't have any time to spend on it. And so I had a quite brilliant Permanent Secretary called Sir William Armstrong, probably the most brilliant public servant since the war. And I learned a great deal of how government worked. That was quite interesting. And I was involved as junior minister in trying to establish a price and incomes policy which I didn't agree with. And that was what sank Edward Heath. Enoch Powell's attacks upon the incomes policy were, I think, his most eloquent speeches he ever made. And that brought Heath down with the miners taking him on. I went to opposition. And I wasn't offered a job in Margaret, which I first won. I joined her when she was absolutely on her rock bottom in 1981. She turned to me and made me a middle-ranking minister. And I sold my such wares as I had to her, but I did a paper on a manifesto for information technology because I was invested in computer companies, Logic and other companies. I knew quite a bit of the early computers. And I persuaded her to have a policy to support fibre optics, which had just been invented in Essex, to support robotics, to support the modern office with paperless office and all of that. And I came with a whole programme of support, and also to get computers into schools. She liked all that. And I was also then persuaded her to privatise British Telecoms. I had to do all of that as well, and privatise cable and wireless, and established the cable industry. And I thought that was quite an interesting, exciting time in my life, because I was doing that post for 3 years, and I was part of the Department of Trade Industry, and I had the sunrise industries, and Norman Tebbit had the sunset industries. He had all the nationalised collapsing. And I liked that. And some important changes were made, the privatisation of British Telecom. If we hadn't got that right, if I hadn't got it right, there'd be no other privatisations. You had to get that one right. And it's very interesting on privatisation. There's not a word about this in the manifesto of 1979 at Margaret's. It was something that she came to 2 years later with British Telecom. And that was one of the most significant changes she made. The descaling of the state as a result of privatising the utilities was one of the biggest changes she made. And I remember going around and preaching privatisation of telecom companies in 1981-82 in Europe to the big state monopolies, and they thought I was a lunatic. And absolutely, they said, of course, these are natural monopolies, don't hear about this privatisation. Only the state can run the telephone system. They're all private now. And the revolution of privatisation was one of the big Thatcherite revolutions, there's no question about that.
That's why we talk about Thatcherism now, yeah. Otherwise we wouldn't have.
Well, there were other things as well. The sale of council houses was very important. The thing about Margaret was that if you look at the period, the whole period from 1945 to 79 was remarkably consistent. It was based upon the architecture which Attlee had created, which was the state directions. Direction from the state was overwhelming. It owned all the major industries in the country. It did planning for them on a 5-year basis, all the plans that Stalin had been proud of. And it was essentially a state-controlled economy that was being run. And successive ministers and governments, whether they were conservative or not, always tried to do a deal, therefore, with the two power blocks, the industrial representations and the trade union representations. And there were endless meetings over sandwiches and beer at number 10, where was in trying to sort this all out. And clearly, by 1979, that age was coming to an end. It ended in the winter of discontent. Both parties had tried to do this, both had failed, and something else was needed. And the needing was the philosophy of Margaret Thatcher and the action of Margaret Thatcher. And she changed absolutely everything in our country. She made us walk tall with pride in the country. She descaled the state. She decided very early on that she was going to be the only person who ran number 10. She was not going to share number 10 with the trade union movement, which is what previous prime ministers had done.
But the economic policies were not actually Lady Thatcher's. They were Keith Joseph's and Enoch Powell's. But she just helped to develop the ideas. Is that right?
I think that the philosophies were certainly Keith Joseph and Enoch Powell. Margaret was not a philosophical conservative. She had instincts. You have to understand Margaret Thatcher. You must go back to her days in Grantham, when she was brought up by her father in that shop. All those Grantham instincts ran through her premiership, and she had very good instincts. And she liked what, I remember having dinner with her several times, Powell and John Knott, and people like that, and she liked, and John Biffin, and she liked what they had to say, because he was the libertarians, and she felt instinctively she wanted to support that, and she did. But you needed someone like Margaret Thatcher to have the determination to carry it through. You know, there were very few politicians who might have given lip service to all of this, but just didn't have the guts to carry things through. But Margaret had the guts to carry things through. The privatisations, the standing up to the unions required real leadership, as it were. And she showed that. And when it came to education reform, the big education reforms, the ones that I brought in, and they were quite opposed by many conservatives. And she said, she said to me, I'll give you my total support. And that is what you need from a leader. And as a result, we changed everything in education, I think, for the better. And I was very lucky to be a politician at the top table when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. It was a glorious time to be around.
And when she appointed you as a Secretary of State for Education, you were expecting her to give you some list of doing things, and instead she asked you to go and to come up with your own policies. Were you surprised?
I was quite surprised by it. I went to Syria number 10. The officer told me, the Prime Minister to see you, I'm just going to offer you education, so please come in. So I go in, and I was very pleased about this, and I expected to get a list from her what I should do. Not at all. She had been Education Secretary. It wasn't the most glorious period of her career, actually, because she had signed the death warrant to more grammar schools than any other ministry in our history, and I'm reminded of that. But she knew how difficult education was.
She was the Education Secretary.
She was the Education Secretary herself under Ted Heath, and she knew there were very powerful forces in the education world, the education establishment, something which Michael Gove was later to call the blob. And therefore she said to me, look, Kenneth, go away and come back in 4 weeks' time and tell me what you think should be done. And I was very relieved at that, because I knew some of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to set up schools independent from local authorities, based upon technology, which I did with the city technology colleges. They were the first schools that were independent of being run by a local authority. That was a breakthrough. They were the forerunners of all the academies, for example, we have today. You had to break the state's ownership of education. And I also introduced the national curriculum, which was needed, and testing and league tables, and student loans to students, all sorts of things. And I was able to do it, not only because my ideas were right, but because in politics, it was a time for change. We had tried from 1979 with Mark Carlyle and with Keith Joseph to change things, and not very much had happened. And it needed a sort of executive type like me to sort of make sure it happened. Because Keith Joseph was much more intellectually distinguished than I am, no question about that, and had a big influence on the ideas, but he was not a very practical person in getting things done. And I was the sort of practical man at the coalface. And so I really enjoyed my time in education, and then she made me party chairman, and then she was beginning to get onto her back foot.
And when you were, actually, was it an achievement for your party that from 1981 to 1987 you added 6 more pages on education in your manifesto?
Yes. We had 6 pages of this is followed by a conversation with her, my ideas, and no education, no Conservative manifesto has never had more on education than that one. The advantage of putting it into your manifesto is that and then you win the election, you can say to the House of Lords, we have an electoral mandate for this. And that is really a very important argument in those days, very, very important argument. And it still carries today. Because sometimes when the House of Lords try to oppose something, the minister will get up and say, no, we are the elected House, we've put in our manifesto, we have the mandate. So that was very helpful in all that time. And we made big changes, and I think they were changes for the better, which survived Labour. Labour opposed every one of them when I brought them in the 1980s, but when they came into office in 1997, they virtually changed nothing. And in fact, Blair liked academies, he came to believe he invented them, but he didn't quite. And he carried through, kept all the other changes in. And particularly, I delegated to schools the responsibility of their own budget. When I started to do this, I'd had representations from teacher unions saying, teachers should not be managers of schools, they are teachers. Other people should do that, local authorities got to manage schools, and they wouldn't be up to that, it's rubbish. As soon as you give people responsibility for money, they grow up quite quickly.
And in 1987, it crossed your mind to resign as the Education for Secretary, but Lady Thatcher persuaded you to remain.
Well, not quite resign, but we had very strong arguments in the committee and all the ministers will tell you that some of the most fiery arguments, sometimes very amusing, sometimes really quite extreme, were on the content of the curriculum. When I would submit to the Cabinet Committee, which Margaret chaired, a document of 30 or 40 pages saying what the maths curriculum would be, the English curriculum, history curriculum, geography curriculum. And we'd spend days working this out, weeks working these out, with whole committees of interested people. And this would be put to the Cabinet. And Mary Margaret had a very simple view. She said, we should concentrate on English, maths and science. And I wanted the more rounded subjects. I wanted languages and humanities brought in, and music and all of that. And the debates on this were really amusing and fierce, because Margaret did her homework. When you looked at the brief she had, you would see that she had made markings on the last page. She'd read them through. She did her homework. Many of my colleagues around the table had not done their homework, but tended to reminisce from their own school days, which is totally irrelevant. And so we had one on, but I remember one, it went on and on one meeting. She said to me, Kenneth, in 20 minutes I'm going to meet King Hussein of Jordan to discuss peace in the Middle East. Why are you still arguing? Why can't you agree what we're going to do? And I said, well look Margaret, I will temporarily agree and I'll bring another paper next week and I would take it away, redraft it slightly and bring it out. And there was one occasion I was reminded of it, I'd forgotten of it, but I remember the Cabinet Secretary saying once to me, he said on one of these debates on education, you actually folded your paper and walked out of the door and said, come back next week. I don't actually remember that. Anyway, it was a very exciting time. Margaret never minded a good debate with her colleagues, as long as they were well briefed. I've seen her absolutely pulverise colleagues who were not well briefed. But if you were well briefed, I was an education very well briefed, you know, she respected you for doing it. Though you didn't agree with her, she respected you. And I came to like her. It was extraordinary. A lot of the people who liked Thatcher in the early years became more detached the more she was in power. I was rather the other way. I was a bit more detached at the beginning. I came to like her more. I came to respect her more, because she was a quite remarkable personality and a great leader. And so I then became a party chair, a very difficult time for her. And of course, in that great crisis, she always used to say she's never been defeated in the country. It was her cabinet who turned on her. It was her cabinet who would not support her. And I strongly advised her to go on, but the majority of the cabinet said she should go, so she went. It was a debacle, really, the election and everything. And that's well recorded in my book anyway, you'll see it all. As I said outside number 10 on that day, we shall not see her like again. She was a quite remarkable person. And then I went on under John Major to be Home Secretary. It's a very important post, but I don't think it's interesting as education, because in education you're dealing with the whole future of the country. In the Home Secretary, you were dealing with the administration of the criminal justice system from day to day, and there are great powerful blocks that you can't do very much about, like the police or the prison service or the courts. You can tinker at the edges, but you can't change very much, and so fundamentally. It's a different type of job altogether. And before the 1992 election, I told John Major I didn't want to go on as a minister. I've been a minister since 1981, and I really want to go back into business. I think that was a very good decision, because the trouble with politicians, they spend a great deal of time planning their entrance into politics and never thinking of their exit. But they should think much more of their exit. And I think some politicians make good exits. Paddy Ashdown made a very good exit. Because after leading the ramshackle Liberal Party, he resigned and went off to run Bosnia. That was quite a good job switch, I would have thought. And the one who didn't do it, who should have done it, was Dennis Healy. Dennis Healy was, in my view, a man of remarkable talent and ability, very interesting man. And when Labour lost in '79, he first tried to lead the party and he was defeated. And at that stage, I think he should have gone off and done a big international job. He had pickworthy, he was very respected in the world, but he stayed on to sort of try and give birth to a renewed Labour Party. I remember him once having lunch with him, some meetings, and none of which both at the same time. I asked him, what he was doing, and he was when Kinnock had just become leader. He said, I'm trying to advise Kinnock to make him Prime Minister, rather, I suppose, like Melbourne advising Queen Victoria. And I knew that was a hopeless task. And it was a pity because he was a man whom I still respect enormously. And similarly, people should decide when they want to move out of politics. But most politicians sort of hang on to the bitter end, and the end can be quite bitter.
And when you were the chairman of the Conservative Party, you said, actually it was one of your big political mistakes to accept it. Why?
Well, I think the chairmanship of the party is a very difficult job to hold, as all party chairmen have found. It's a rather strange position. It has a great responsibility for what was then quite a large organisation. But you are the front man apologising for other people. And I was constantly on television when other ministers would appear to defend their policy, or defending policies, some of which were a bit strange to say the least, or had gone wrong. And you are the front man. You try and do what you can. In fact, we had a very successful conference. The two conferences I had were successful conferences. And my job was to get Margaret through 1990 without another leadership election. And it almost came off. But Geoffrey Howe decided that he'd had enough and made that speech that led to an election that year, although Michael Heseltine did not expect an election to occur, nor did I. I'd have preferred to have stayed on education, quite frankly, and be a party chairman, because the longer you stay in education, your changes you introduce become more permanent. And I was very concerned that the things I had introduced, the legacy was going to be watered down. Strangely enough, it wasn't. It wasn't by Labour. They kept basically the legacy I left, which I'm very pleased about, and they've improved upon it. And I don't think they're going to do, if they were to win next time, they won't change it fundamentally, they'll develop it even further.
And when you said in your book that...
The other reason, of course, why I said that, of course, is that Margaret had actually had several party chairmen who weren't very loyal to her. And although Norman Tate was close to her, she became a bit suspicious of his ambitions after the 86-7 election, and Norman went into the background of politics, which is a mistake.
To take care of his wife.
Particularly after his wife, for the very best reasons, let me say that at once. Another party chairman had sort of almost run an alternative leadership campaign. I told her, I said, look, Margaret, you made me party chairman. I want you to know I should be loyal to you right through to whatever happens. And although people came to me at the leadership election and said, why you don't say, I said, no, I gave my support to Margaret. I will support her right through, which I did right to the end. And so, of course, I went down, but I'm not worried about that. But I thought that was my duty.
And Geoffrey Howe's resignation didn't make it more difficult for you to unite the party as the party chairman, and because you said actually his resignation speech was more about style than substance.
Yes, that is true. I think Geoffrey had put up with enough bullying, quite frankly. And she was rather... I remember when he made his speech, I was sitting next to her on the bench, on the front bench, and as she got up, she turned to me and she said, I never thought he'd do it. Well, she pushed Geoffrey in a way, she belittled him, and there's only so much someone can take like that. And she didn't handle him at all well. She took the house away from Cheveney, which was a mistake. He had got nowhere else to live apart from that place. And I think he was humiliated and given a sort of secondary role.